Um, at this point, I think I will turn it over to Anu, who is our programs coordinator, and have her introduce our tonight's program. Anu? Anu, are you there? Are you frozen?
Are we good? Okay.
Are you there? There you
Am
are.
I
Okay.
frozen? So
yeah,
welcome
you kind
to
of
our first.
You're very choppy.
Can you, for everybody, can you do this? Turn off your videos for just a few minutes while I do the introductions. That'll help me with bandwidth issues for just a little while. Okay, I think that's already made a difference. So what I was about to say is welcome everyone to our first program of the year. Starting us off wonderfully and on a really positive note are Daryl Gray and Wendy Scherrer. Daryl Gray has a Master of Science from Western Washington University, where I teach, so he's one of our alums, very proud. Daryl is project manager for the Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association, or NC, that's the acronym for Nooksack Salmon Enhancement Association. Daryl has been with NC for over 25 years. He leads their instream and riparian restoration projects. He deals with designs, permits, and implementation of these projects. So he coordinates NC's native plant nursery as well. He deals with the restoration crews and project funding, all that sort of thing. Daryl works in partnership with landowners and also with county, state, and federal agencies. Now, Wendy Sharer is a familiar and beloved face for all of us who've been members of Coma Cultion for a bit. Wendy has a master's in education. Since 1977, she has dedicated herself to using environmental education as a tool for addressing development, restoration, and sustainability issues relating to watershed health. After a career in education and environmental planning, she is now retired, but probably just as busy as she was before retirement. Wendy is the executive director at NC. She has co-authored a curriculum guide for teachers. The title of this guide is Celebrating Wildflowers, an educator's guide to the appreciation and conservation of native plants of Washington. This guide is a collaboration between WNPS and North Cascades Institute. Wendy continues her heroic efforts this morning at 8 a.m., 8 o'clock in the morning. She was at Kendall Creek Hatchery, where she was picking up chum eggs that she delivered to 16 schools in the county. The kids will watch the salmon develop, and I think they ultimately release the little whatchamacallit, the little par, or maybe an earlier stage into the local streams. So that's the kind of things she does, and Daryl and Wendy have again been doing wonderful work, and you'll see that for yourself as the talk unfolds. So without further ado, here's Daryl and Wendy. I think Wendy is going first, right?
Yes, yes.
So over to you, Wendy. Go ahead,
yes.
Wendy.
Yes, so I'm going to share my screen, see if this works. Is it working? Am I sharing my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Share. Got it?
There we go.
Yay. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Anu and the team. I have to confess, this is my first PowerPoint I've tried to do, and thank goodness Amy Andert, who's part of our group, she's a professor up at UBC. She's talked to our group before. And Anu, it took 2 botany professors to figure out how to teach Daryl and myself how to do this today. So yay for our professors in our group. But another confession is I've only taken 1 botany class. It was from Ron Taylor back in the 70s, and he didn't even make us learn the Latin names. So when I worked with North Cascades Institute and WNPS to write that curriculum, Laura Padash and Art Krukeberg and Ron Taylor, they all had to agree on a definition of a native plant in Washington State. It took 2 months. Everybody had a little different idea. So it was my entree into really how to teach a 4th grade teacher in common language about what is a native plant, what is the awareness, how to build the knowledge and the tools to appreciate and protect native plants. So I'm kind of an elementary kind of teacher level, but because I was an environmental planner, my other confession is I worked kind of for the dark side. I worked with writing environmental impact statements for several years. And we had to, describe the conditions and then, what the impacts were going to be and mitigating measures. And my last environmental impact statement was Bella's Fair Mall. So, and then I went into the nonprofit world. So, I've kind of gone from the public, private, nonprofit worlds to see how everybody does things. So today I'm going to share a little bit about my own neighborhood work. And I'm also on the board of the Happy Valley Neighborhood Association. So Anu asked me to do this last year and I said, you gotta wait till this year. So Daryl and I kind of put together about an hour long. And at the end, we will take questions. We have a lot of content. So if you can save your questions till the end, that would be really great. So I wanted to start with saying that I'm a member of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and you can be a member for not too much money. But I thought we'd go to the top to kind of get some definitions so we could start with that. And I did try to write a curriculum guide about restoration for elementary teachers, but it never really happened with Binda Colebrook. But basically, we want to discuss what is restoration and then how we think about it and give you a couple of examples. My examples are going to be in my little neighborhood, Happy Valley neighborhood in south of Western. And then Daryl's going to share some of his work out in the county. So first of all, the current definition, there's a few definitions that SCR has, but I wanted to emphasize that the word process. So we assist the recovery of ecosystems that are degraded or damaged or destroyed, but it's not a product, it's a process. And I think you'll hear that word process throughout this presentation. And I think if we can work in the next, decades to educate people about what is that process in their own backyard, they will do a good job. I'm going to turn off this light, which is kind of blinking on me right now. Okay, here we go. So believe it or not, this is the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So from 2021 to 2030, the emphasis is to restore our planet, and they have many strategies. So I'm not going to read all of this, but you'll notice if you join SCR, you can get a wealth of information on restoration all around the world. And there's a chapter here in the Northwest also. And this, some of the words you're going to hear today is building capacity, shifting behaviors, celebrating, incentivize it, technical capacity. And for the next generation, that's my thing, is try to educate people at all ages. So if you join, you can share some of this information with your own groups around the state and around the county and with your different stakeholders in the public and private sectors. So SCR has 8 principles. And, when Daryl and I started this work in the 70s and the 80s, and we all have gray hair now, we really didn't have any roadmap, and we still don't really have a roadmap, but we're trying to get our act together in terms of at least defining a process for our own local ecosystem. And because Daryl and I have worked together with salmon, we really work on a watershed landscape based level. And the watershed that we're working in here is called WIRA, or Watershed Resource Inventory Area 1, which is basically the Whatcom County area. It doesn't really include the Sandwich Basin. So my first example I'm going to give is the Happy Valley neighborhood, which is the biggest neighborhood by population in the city. We have about 7,000 people. It's only about 640 acres, but it goes from Fairhaven Parkway to Bill McDonald Parkway, from I-5 to Fairhaven. And we have the densest neighborhood in the city. We have 78% multifamily housing. And we do believe in infilling in our neighborhood, and so we accept a lot of growth in our neighborhood. We've worked very hard with Western and as well as City of Bellingham in figuring out how we can cram so much into a little 640 acres. So we're a very active and engaged neighborhood, and we have worked on several sites. So the Panna Creek corridor, maybe we could get Annalise Burns to come and talk about some continuing work there, but we have gotten a corridor pretty much from now underneath I-5 all the way down to the bay, a corridor for the salmon, and it's pretty much barrier free for the salmon. In addition to that, we're trying to get north and south corridors, and we've been trying to connect the Chuckanuts with Seahome Arboretum, and that would be through the Connolly Creek Trail, which is the Connolly Creek Nature Area. We have Happy Valley Park, only really one park in our neighborhood, and the Connolly Creek Trail that we're going to be talking about is actually just a trail. It's not a real park. But back when I was a teacher back in the 80s, I worked with Tim Wall, who was a Greenways coordinator, and my kids went to this area and was all going to be developed. And it had been logged, and there was a farm there that Joe's Garden had tried to get going along Donovan, and there was a stormwater facility in there. And so we started with that, and we tried to figure out what to do. And that was our back in 1985, we started this project. So I just summarized here a few of the key milestones that we have accomplished here. So we started with the basic kind of elementary education, environmental ed. And most of the teachers back then got training on Project Learning Tree, which DNR connected with, Project Wild, which was Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Adopt a Stream work. We got grants from DNR, Department of Fisheries, Department of Game, which were two different departments, and even the Port of Bellingham, the City of Bellingham, gave us money to do stream restoration in Little Connolly Creek. So we started then, and at that time, DNR, it was like 100th or 50th anniversary, and they said, we're going to plant trees that are going to be around here for the next 500 years. And they came with 100 little cedars, and we planted them right in the middle of these reed canary grass patches. Well, I went there last weekend to take some pictures, and I could really only find about 4 trees. And it's like abysmal failure. And so, you know, I've had this long relationship with this property, you know, the good, bad, and the ugly. But back when we were very, you know, we were trying to get things done, and the children in my class went to the city council, and we had a little plan, and we said we wanted to be a nature area. And just like that, the city council said yes. And Tim Wall said, here's some flagging tape, go and make a trail. And they made the trail, and that's where it is now. And it's a hiking trail, a biking trail. It's a well-used classroom for Western, Seahome, Happy Valley, and the schools there, and the families that live in the neighborhood. And then shortly after that, we had a group called Tree Keepers, and we met every month. And there was a guy named Jeff Middaugh, and he was on the Parks Board, and he was a retired forester from USDA. And he said, how about if we make a management plan? And so a professional forester worked with us to make a plan. So great, you know, instead of shooting from our hip, we started to structure what is a plan. But look how long it took to get to that point. So don't give up. About at that time also, Huxley, I think, had this, I don't know, 30th, 40th anniversary. Anyway, Eric Dinerstein, who's the chief scientist for the World Wildlife Fund, came and did a talk about a green infrastructure way to analyze your area. And he showed us how we could use LIDAR. And we hired or got a volunteer intern from Western, and she analyzed our whole neighborhood about how much green canopy was in our neighborhood, all the way from Seahome Village, all the way to Fairhaven. And we zoned it out, and we wrote a little plan, and the city approved it to increase our green infrastructure in our neighborhood 10% in the next 20 years. And then since then, we've kind of used that plan to educate everybody about what do we want to do next. So that was kind of a little bit of a history of that. So my work again with education was getting dirty on the ground. Our first grants were used for boots. It's a wetland, very wet forested wetland. And so we worked with all these different departments. We got money wherever we could, and the kids were so inspired. And they were, some of them, when we asked them what they wanted it to be, some of them wanted it to be Disneyland, some of them wanted to be nothing. But we finally pushed through this plan. And luckily, when Tim Wall made these signs, they made them out of ceramics. And Alan, take a look at those because they've lasted all this time. Those are over 30 years old. And if you go to the corridor, start at Donovan, go all the way to Joe's Gardens on those trails. And then the management plan, and I'm willing to send anybody any of these documents, and I have my email at the end of this, but we have in the city parks department this management plan. Now you know that bureaucrats change, they come and go. So one park director comes, another one comes, one restoration manager comes, another one comes. A lot of them people don't even know this plan exists. So our job as citizens is to remind them there is a plan as we continue to work in this area. But this plan was built on collaboration between the public and private sectors. It was a landscape scale forest plan based on what were the historic vegetative structures modified for the social setting, which is this very dense neighborhood in this urban landscape. It defined both short-term and long-term goals and implementation opportunities. So it's some of the last remaining big Sitka spruces in there. And I don't know why they weren't cut down, but they're still there. And then we kind of use the area up by Point Whitehorn, kind of that area that goes down to the beach kind of as a reference reach. We're kind of looking at other forests that were kind of like this. And so we were looking at the historic vegetative structure around this area, as well as some other areas in the county that were kind of close to the bay. So we divided the plan. We divided the Connolly Creek Nature Area into 3 zones. So we had that mature Sitka spruce forest. There were a few invasives there, particularly ivy, but we knew we didn't have to work on that as much. And then there was the alder transition zone, which was about, I don't know, at that point, about 50 years old. And the old field, which is closer to Donovan. And it was basically all cleared out in the 50s, and the alders were coming up when I was teaching there in the 1980s. So that had the most invasives. And I would say that the most invasive that I really get irritated is those terrible English hawthorns. But there are actually some native hawthorns there too. So what we've been doing is trying to now, I'm now fast forwarding to now, is trying to teach everybody from Wild Whatcom that brings kids there to Seahome High School and Happy Valley that brings kids there, to volunteer work parties that the city does with the parks and public works, how we want to do this. So this area, this zone that we're calling, the old field zone, we learned that it was too wet for the spruce and the cedars. And so we've actually mounded up the soil and mounded it up with mulch. And so you actually have the the roots up a little bit above the water. And you'll see the sitka spruce have done fine, but the cedars really get munched by the many deer that are in our neighborhood. So the more we put time into clearing out everything before we plant, planting larger trees, caging things and protecting them from invasive, then the better we have our survival. Randomly, Bill Cantrell planted these sequoias, Coast Redwoods, when his kids were little, and his kids are all grown up now. And those have done better than anything ever. They've grown faster. They really kill the understory underneath. They're not typically native here, but we're using these now a little bit more for restoration. And if you go to the Connolly Creek Nature Area, you'll see these redwoods, and it's like, where do they come from? Well, we planted them back in the 80s. So we continue to have ongoing work parties. And if you have any students from any colleges or high schools or any level that needs some credit, or we use, people that need to do community service from the Alternative Corrections Program from the jail, we will give you hours. So I wanted to, before we get into deeper restoration strategies, I just wanted to share my own little model, which is my model for environmental education, which is promote awareness. And so if we don't know what a native plant is, how do we teach somebody what it is, a native plant? And what is a non-native plant? It's as important to teach somebody what a non-native or an invasive plant is, as well as what a native plant is. Develop a deeper knowledge so we get more scientific knowledge, and you get the best scientific knowledge. And I have to confess, I don't know all the Latin names, nor all the new Latin names, but at least if I can get the common names, we can develop more knowledge. And so my goal is to, make sure every fourth grader knows 10 native plants in their own backyard at least. And then acquire the correct tools, the physical tools, the strategies, the scientific tools to use. And the most important thing is, before you take action, do everything else, but don't forget to take action. And these work parties, like Alan mentioned today, are so important to have regular work parties scheduled for people to show up. They wanted to show up, you have to do the work to get them there. So the next project I'm going to talk about is a case study. And we've had a lot of angst in our neighborhood about right-of-ways. And the Douglas Street right-of-way up 21st Street was just sold to a developer. And we were very pissed off, our neighborhood was, that the apartment owner could take that and made it a driveway. And we were understanding that undeveloped rights of way were really the public's. Well, it's really partly the private sector can have a right to develop up to the center line. So we've had many angry and kind and deep conversations with the city public works folks on rights of way in the last 2 years. And we discovered there are 52 undeveloped rights of ways just in our neighborhood alone. So this is one, it's just 1 block away from my house. And it's between 21st and 22nd on the Larrabee undeveloped right of way. It was an old stormwater pond for Adric Place, which is just to the north, that the developer never did a good job, and the city bought it back for $150,000. And so they could never put a street in there. And we had asked the city many times to do something. And so finally, one day, two years ago, on a June day, they cut down 8-foot tall blackberries. And they said, okay, it's yours now, make a plan. So we came up with a plan, and I made a plan with about 20 different kinds of native plants. And the non-natives are the worst non-natives there. And the city approved of it. And so we got a little money from the mayor's Small and Simple grant, and $500 from our chapter of the Native Plant Society, and a lot of public and private fundraisers have been done. And we this is a plan. Amy helped me take these pictures. They're kind of wet now because I take them out to the field to show people this, but it was just kind of in the back of a napkin plan originally. It wasn't really fancy. My daughter, who's a landscape architect, has done a little bit more detailed plan of the Pollinator Mound, but we have an agreement, and so the landowners on both sides know about the plan, the city knows about the plan, and we know about the plan. So we try to follow the plan now. And so what we've been trying to do is kind of use some of those strategies that the Society of Ecological Restoration has, which is engaging with our stakeholders, and think about who are the stakeholders when you do a project, drawing on many kinds of knowledge, engineers, landscape architects, arborists, habitat restorationists, nursery people, construction workers have helped us so much with defining what we can do here. And looking at other ecosystems that are good reference reaches, and then starting with, removing the invasives and assessing our goals. If we really want to get here in 20 years, what do we need to do now? So these are just a few pictures of some things, and some of you might recognize yourselves in here. But we started, I said the city had mowed down the blackberries. So we had months of digging out blackberries by the root balls. And this is a picture of Xavier Tuxel and a couple boys with a 25-foot bamboo that we've been cutting the bamboo that the neighbor had planted next door. And so taking out the bamboo as well as the blackberries and the hawthorns and the hemlock and the many other invasives, and then heavy duty sheet mulching it, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 layers of cardboard. We know where the best big cardboard is now. There's Jim Davis smiling with that cardboard and getting all different ages on a work party on Saturdays to do this. We've used, and there's Wendy Bergeson. So we've used deer fencing for the Pollinator Mound, and we worked with Bee City USA, which is now Bellingham's Bee City USA, to make a mound featuring species that were flowering for pollinators, as well as a hedgerow that is flowering for pollinator species also. So here's the Lonemans, and they had taken the class with the Native Plant Society, with the city, and we can see there's some new native hawthorns that we've planted, and we've caged them, and some blue tubes that a high school girl has made a little bouquet of. So we keep working, and we finally got some signs. We were putting them up this month now that the snow is gone, and we try to acknowledge the collaborators on things so people feel good and know who's been working on this. And so I would acknowledge the City of Bellingham's, not the Public Works and Parks Department, our Native Plant Chapter, as well as the Neighborhood Association Board and members. So it hopefully will, with the other various undeveloped rights of way in Bellingham, that we can take some lessons from here. It's not going to be perfect, but we will learn more as we do more with this. So again, the SER model, and this, because we're recording this, you can go and look at some of the best resources that I feel that I've used in our projects. And we have the largest native plant nursery in the state here in Whatcom County, Fourth Corner, and planted sativas right downtown. And then both the tribes, Lummi and Nooksack, have a lot of habitat restoration experience, as well as NC. And the Conservation District, of course, is time now to order plants from them. And city and county both have restoration experts too. So I'm going to leave with this, that a couple little things. Camellias, I found, can look backward and forward at the same time. And so sometimes we want to go to the end point first and just plant a tree. We plant a cedar tree in the middle of reed canary grass. But then I look backward and I say, no, that's not the way we do it. How do we look forward? So I think that restoration, I don't get bummed out about taking out invasives. I kind of get angry at those plants, but I have a positive approach. And so I think my take on restoration is that it's a driver of hope. It's a positive thing to do. you can't do it by yourself. It can't be done in a silo. Collaboration is essential. And it is really an industry of hope. And if we can work together in Whatcom County and Bellingham, I think we can lead the way. We can lead the agencies. We can help the agencies, and they can help us in special places that we want to restore. So with that, I'm going to introduce Daryl Gray, who is probably the best restorationist that I know in our counties. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Wendy. That was an amazing presentation.
A lot of stuff.
So I guess first I should ask, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. And as Wendy mentioned, herself and myself go back quite a few years, and we've been at this for a while. And I'll start by saying I think Wendy is a very open-minded and inclusive person, and I appreciate that. And I come from more of a construction background, which is more just like, let's do what works. Like let's learn from our mistakes quickly, and let's try and do what works. So I hope this doesn't sound a little terse in my presentation, but it is just kind of direct and to the point. And thing I first, I guess, want to emphasize is that, and maybe Wendy, well, you could see the time frame that it took her to accomplish some projects in Happy Valley. I think, yeah, the time frame is critical. Like if you don't have the time to dedicate to it, you're probably bound to fail. So for NC, we feel like 5 years is the minimum. Like that is an absolute minimum. So when somebody says, oh, let's just go plant some trees, I'm like, you really got to be thinking longer term as to how those trees or how those plants will adapt and survive. And so we've narrowed it down to, again, a few pretty succinct things. And I understand that people could say, well, you know, there's better approaches or different approaches, and I'm sure there are. I don't doubt that for a second. But if you don't have the time to give to a project, and my major emphasis is kind of outlined in these 4 points, if you don't have time to do the site preparation and the follow-up maintenance and monitoring, then everything in between is really not going to work. So when we go to a site, I want to elaborate a little bit more. That's what we're thinking about. Like, what do we have to do to prepare this site for our native plants to succeed? What plants will do best on this specific site? And you know, I think that we learned this really quickly, and Wendy could probably share some stories too, where we went out and said, oh, this is great, we'll just plant these plants, and then we came back and the plants were all gone. So if you can't anticipate, and I'm using predation, people say browsing, I don't know, when I see a cedar tree reduced to nothing and eaten, I kind of think of that as predation. I don't really think of that browsing, but you could use those interchangeably. And if you can't anticipate those forces that are going to come in and interrupt your restoration efforts, then you're not going to succeed. And then the biggest one is the follow-up maintenance and monitoring. Unless you're committed to come back and maintain, as Wendy showed in a lot of her slides, those invasives, you might get some or most of them, but they're going to come back and they're going to constantly compete with your planting. So I think Wendy did a really good job talking about a plan. So our plans always start with a pre-vegetation survey. So I think in the past, back when Wendy and I first started, this was all kind of drawn on paper and maps. Fortunately, now we have survey equipment, we have GIS software that we can bring onto site, and we can do a survey of the site and identify everything that is there, especially the invasive species, and we can map those through a site. As far as native species, plant species selection, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the future. I would have to say that we have tried a lot of different things, and we've kind of settled on this works and this might work, but it would take a lot more maintenance to make it succeed. So we're possibly omitting some plants that might be suitable to a particular site. And if we ever get the chance to go back and add those to a site, that would be icing on the cake. But we really want to establish something that's going to grow, going to survive in the long term. I already mentioned about, the browse protection, and we've definitely learned our lessons, from voles to beavers to deer to elk, that we can do everything right, and then our sites will be sufficiently or increasingly degraded by predation or browsing. Talk a little bit about mulch. Again, when we were talking earlier, when I mentioned earlier, if you don't have a maintenance plan, if you don't have a long-term maintenance plan and the resources to commit to that plan, then everything else is kind of a waste of time. And the monitoring plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about monitoring. I'm sure that a lot of people that are listening to this are maybe even more experienced than myself in monitoring. But again, if you can't go back and constantly check on how your project is succeeding and adapt your management and stuff, again, your project probably will not succeed. I should have had Wendy over here to do with her slideshow presentation or slideshow layout, because of course it's just black and white. I tried to stick a few photos into it, but then I have to adjust all my font. It didn't really work. So sorry, very old school black and white. So as Wendy mentioned too, when we go into a site, hopefully, preferably, we have a reference reach upstream or downstream, similar soil, similar aspect, and we can kind of look at what native plants are succeeding in that area. And that'll kind of direct us to what plants we want to install, or at least look at the succession and where we want to end up. We really want to look at invasive species and browsing pressure, because that might also determine what plants we select for that particular site. Obviously, when we go out, we may put together a plan and a list of plants, but when you get out on the site, you're looking at more micro sites, like what the type of soil is, what the moisture is, what the aspect is. Plant layout can also be influenced on how we're going to maintain it. So if it's a larger site, multiple acres, larger buffers, mechanical or physical maintenance is going to be pretty difficult. So we will kind of lay out things in rows. And though I don't like rows, we will mix things up to make it not look like a row. But if we can bring in equipment and maintain easier on larger sites, we will typically plant in rows. So as I mentioned before, we may look at a site and say, oh, this would be great here, this would be great here. But over the years, we've thought through experience that certain plants need less maintenance, certain plants provide more shade quicker. And so we've kind of narrowed it down to a list of plants that require lesser maintenance or have a greater chance to succeed in a certain situation. Because I think, we'll talk about this a little bit in the next couple of slides, is maintenance is what undoes your project. So if you keep doing more and more projects, and maintenance keeps increasing, and eventually if you have a limited capacity or limited workforce, that is, you won't be able to maintain your sites. Talk a little bit about potted versus bare root plants, which is kind of more of a volunteer orientated planting parties. Sometimes potted is versus bare roots, stock handling, quantity over quality. So this is our current list of what we have in our nursery. And this isn't a definite list. I mean, if we went to a certain landowner and they said, well, we really like a certain plant, and we'll say, well, that might work or it might not work, or we'll give it a try. So Wendy might have mentioned too, there are some incredible resources near to us here in Whatcom County. We have the Fourth Corner Nursery, and then we have the Plant Material Center down in Bow. So we have access to an incredible diverse amount of plants, and we will, consider bringing in other plants, but these are kind of plants that we have in our nursery because these have worked well for us. So as I mentioned, we have a native plant nursery. You can tell by the picture that we have, predation problems or browse problems. So it's all fenced off, deer and rabbits. And we have a lot of large cottonwoods around our site, as you can see up in the right corner, top right corner. So we actually cover our whole nursery in a lighter kind of gauze fabric right when those cottonwoods go to seed. Otherwise, we end up with a lot of cottonwood seeds in our pots, which will outcompete. We use shade cloth on an old greenhouse structure to raise other plants that don't tolerate so much sunlight. So we typically work in lowland streams, so lower gradient, primarily in the lower Nooksack. I would say about 60–70% of our planting is below the Nugent's Corner Highway or Mount Baker Highway crossing, but we do a number of projects on the forks also. But again, we're primarily down in the lowlands. We're not up in the upper watershed. And so these are the common soils that, if you look at the soil atlas, these are probably the 3 most common soils that we plant in. And these are the trees that have, I guess, over time been most successful in those type of soils. And obviously soil hydrogeology stuff is changing. So in every site there could be, you might think this is going to work, but the current hydrology is probably not going to make it work. So I want to talk a little bit about conifers, and I'll preface that by saying that if we're on a creek site where a landowner is just saying, hey, you can have it all, we're going to say you need to go into CREP, you need to go into Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, get some income back for the land that you're putting into restoration. And if that isn't acceptable to them, then we'll say, okay, well, we'll develop a planting plan for you that would work for your current land use situation. Where I'm going with this is that in those situations, now we're down to narrower buffers. So whereas CREP will plant 2/3 the potential tree height, maximum 180 feet, the landowner says, well, I'll give you 30. So we are fish centric, and a lot of these sites have been degraded by past land use practices, and they're dominated by reed canary grass. Their buffers are, several old alder surrounded by blackberry. We really want to try and get rid of that reed canary grass, at least in the channel, and develop, some quick shade over that creek. So these larger conifers are really important to us. So this is something we've struggled with, and we've kind of hit stumbling blocks over time. So I'm just going to start here with Sitka spruce. So we thought Sitka spruce was kind of our savior because beavers didn't like it too much. Deer didn't like it too much. Elk kind of left it alone. So we're like, this is it. And it will tolerate, it has a wider tolerance than say Douglas fir or Western red cedar. And I'm sure you all understand that. But so we just thought this is the greatest tree ever. So we started planting a lot of Sitka spruce. And what we noticed was probably around 2000, we started to see tip die back on the Sitka spruce. And it was like, oh boy, here's a tree that's kind of stunted. Here's another tree that's kind of stunted. Well, by the early 2000s, we went back to sites and 90% of all spruce were topped out at about 8 feet due to pine beetles laying their eggs in the tips, and they developed multiple leaders and they would never succeed. So here was our dream plant, and suddenly now it's just a shrub, and that has pretty much stayed true. I could show you pictures of entire sites where every spruce is 8 to 10 feet, and that's it. Western red cedar, great tree for shade, long-lived, but I guess most of you have probably been paying attention to recent news that Western red cedar are having a harder time. And I guess probably about the same time, 2000, we just started to notice more mortality, specifically if it had exposure to the northeast outflow from the Fraser River. So if you planted, say, north of Smith Road, I don't know if everybody knows where that is, but if you planted towards the north part of the county and you got a significant northeast wind, the cedar would have a difficult time. Opposite, if they were on a side of the creek that faced south or southwest and had a lot of sun, they would have a considerably hard time. So our mortality in cedar, we'd go out to sites and look at overall mortality would be about 10%, which was acceptable. We're kind of shooting for 85%, but then Western red cedar would be 40%. If I went back to that soil list, you see Douglas fir in a couple of them, but I assume again, everybody was like, Douglas fir doesn't like wet soil, and in a lot of areas we're planting in, they are clay rich, wet soil. So even though Douglas fir did well, there was very few places that we could plant them. Western hemlock was kind of hit and miss. We've had probably as much success with Western hemlock as we have with red cedar. If everything went well, it'd be great. But 5-6 years down the road, we'd come back, it'd be dead. So we're still planting Western hemlock. But I guess where I'm going here is that if you have a 30-foot buffer, a 40-foot buffer, and you want to provide a lot of shade on that creek, and you choose all Western red cedar and 40% of them die, then you don't have much shade or much of a buffer at all. So we started to struggle, like, well, we need to find some other conifers, long-lived conifers that produce a lot of shade. And so we started to introduce yellow cedar, incense cedar, and giant sequoia. We did also introduce, we started just anecdotally trying different species, but these were the 3 species that we settled on. And to be more scientific about it, we have worked with 2 professors at Western and set up 15 sites that have 3 different treatments with these 3 species. We're only 2 years into that, but again, it's not statistically relevant, but so far, incense cedar seems hands down the best other cedar that we planted. Yellow cedar second, giant sequoia less so. And I could talk more about that if people want to. We put out kind of an annual monitoring report every year, and it will kind of detail what we've seen, but we're not really thinking that we'll have any statistical data probably for 5 to 10 years. So this is probably controversial, but and if I need to speed up, let me know, because I know I'm kind of elaborating a lot of stuff that I could probably course over. We learned earlier on, as I mentioned earlier, that maintenance is what's going to limit your restoration activities. And as if we're just physically removing invasives, be that by hand or with weed whackers or whatever, there's just no way we could stay on top of the maintenance of all the sites that we were planting. So we've chosen to use herbicide, where we have 8 licensed aquatic herbicide applicators on our staff. We take it very seriously. We do our NPDS permit annually, and we follow all the guidelines, but we really feel that if we do not use this, we cannot expand our restoration activities. Reed canary grass, which is typically, I guess, the most invasive or competitive plant with our plantings, we just use it. We just mow it and we just spray. We just mow it. We put stakes where we're going to plant. We spray circles around those areas, and then we plant. And Himalayan blackberry, again, we don't want to be overhanded with spray. We're not using crossbow, not using a Mazapure, and we have to go through our board and we've researched this. This is what we think. We know this is what the EPA approves. We're using glyphosate. We do a combination again of mowing and then coming back and spraying in the fall, and then we will follow up if there's a lot of regrowth from maybe plants or crowns we missed, or just the seed source that's underlying the site. And if it's entwined with natives, like our typical rule is if it's 60% native, 40% black, we're going to try and just cut the stems and treat them and keep that riparian, that native riparian plant that's already existing. Knotweed, a lot of this stuff comes from the Sandy River studies down in Oregon. Different options. This is something, once knotweed is or if knotweed is in a site, that's something we're going to kind of flag and stay on top of it for multiple years. Morning glory, nightshade, purple lice. A lot of this we can physically remove, but we definitely never get it all. So we might come back, we may try physical removal, and then we'll try and come back and treat it with glyphosate. English ivy, so everybody knows, like, not many herbicides kill English ivy, so that's mostly physical removal, but we have doing some stem treatment with triclopyr, and that's been pretty successful. Somebody mentioned, or Wendy mentioned, British hawthorn. We've used this EasyJet lance, which shoots a pellet of glyphosate directly into the trunk, and it's been really successful because you can just go into a site and just target those trees and not have any impact on the other plants that are around. So as I mentioned, this is just a little example. So we would go in, try to do it before July 1st, mow all the blackberry to the ground. We want to get it back up to a manageable height, usually about knee, mid-thigh, and then we'll go in and apply our herbicide. Glyphosate, probably both triclopyr, not that effective earlier in the season when things are rigorously growing. But if you were to hit this in the fall, say September, October, or even early mid-November, we'll get 100%. Well, I shouldn't say 100%. You're going to have something come back, but we could go back and start planting this site the following year. So when we go back to what we said before, we're talking about a year of just getting the site prepared before we even think about planting. Because if we can't control the invasives on this site, then we're, again, just kind of wasting our time putting native plants into it. I mentioned a little earlier about bull, beaver, deer protection. When I first started working, this is Wendy and I think it was about a 2 or 3 person operation at that point in time. There have been some previous plantings done out in 4 Mile Creek, tributary of 10 Mile Creek, a tributary of the Nooksack, just north of the Axton Road and south of the Beard Road. So again, I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, but kind of middle of the county, lowland stream, lots of reed canary grass. And they had done these, I thought, amazing planting projects. And when I got hired in 95, let's go out and see how things are doing. And I would say that project was a kind of an extreme failure. Like 90% of the plants were gone. And you could attribute about 70%. I have more data to support that, was just predation by wolves and beavers. Just so I think intentions are good. Let's just go out and plant. And if you can't control the invasives or control the predation by other critters, you're kind of wasting your time by planting. And we noticed this same thing at a number of other sites. We plant like, oh, wolves aren't bad. Suddenly the beavers come in. Well, the beavers, we've got those out of control. We got 3-foot cages on, the deer come in. And so again, if you plant the plant, I think you've got to do everything you can to get it up and free growing and out of the effect of these predators. So we install protection on everything that we plant that we feel has some pressure from whatever, if there's deer or elk or on that site. And we fence everything. Sorry, we put an individual cage around those plants we feel are most susceptible. And then if we have a lot of elk or extreme deer, then we alter our planting plan and we just plant in kind of these larger enclosed circles, which are a 5-foot fence with T-posts. And so we're just kind of creating islands of native vegetation. And I've got nothing against wolves, beaver, deer, elk. I just want to kind of get something up and growing before they come in and take their share. So as I mentioned, like we're going to everything we plant, we're going to put a tube around it, and that is for the vole predation. So I'm assuming a lot of people are familiar with the meadow voles. So in the winter months, primarily, when they're lacking other food sources, they will actually go in and girdle these plants by chewing the Cambrian layer off and then kill the plant. And I know a lot of people don't like the look of blue tubes, but they do help a lot for voles. And then if we're going back in to maintain this site, it's very clear, where the plants are, if we're using herbicide applications. If we have conifers, there are bigger trees where the blue tubes don't really work, we use a spiral tree wrap. Again, this is just to avoid that girdling at the base of the plant. Cages, I think I already mentioned. So we would cage, again, this is probably something we should have foreseen earlier, but we would put a 3-foot cage on to stop beavers, and then they would get up and they'd be fine. No beaver predation, and then deer would come on and take the tops of the plants off. So we just said, okay, forget it. We're just going to go with 5-foot cages on everything. So then we don't have to worry about beavers, and we don't have to worry about deer. So this, again, we're just kind of caging the trees that we know the deer are going to focus on. Other sites I mentioned where we're just like so much impact by deer or elk, we'll actually take a group of plants, maybe an island of about 20-30 plants, and we'll just cage that whole circle. And then we'll step over here and we'll cage another circle. So we're just saying, you can have everything around this, but within this circle, we want those plants to succeed. Another thing I think we learned rather earlier, we've been doing this on a number of sites, is this de-leveling. So again, we work on lowland streams. A lot of them have had heavy agricultural use for many, many years. So in this is a shot in the lower left corner of 10 Mile Creek. This is Hemi Road. And again, if you're familiar with it, but it's a very low gradient. And, it was cleared of timber. I've talked to a number of landowners. Oh yeah, my great uncle cut all these big trees down or whatever. So, and then they grazed it and tilled it. And so you have this just extremely flat environment where reed canary grass dominates. I mean, it just can outcompete anything in this situation. So we started, I think it was probably back in the late 90s, we started doing these mounds. And so what we're essentially doing is kind of creating a nurse log. You know, if you walk into if this was forested, it would be hummocky and rolly just from, you know, hundreds or thousands of years of trees falling down, which create all these unique niches for other trees to grow up. So we're like, oh, well, we can't fly in, you know, all this old growth logs and lay them down. So we're just going to create these little mounds, and just to give it enough difference that other species could survive on that and compete against the grass. So this is the last project we did on 10 Mile in that reach. There's 3 miles downstream. So if you're looking this left corner, I don't know if you can even see my cursor, but this is Hemi Road. And if you go downstream, there's about 3 miles of restoration. So the picture on the right, that was all de-leveled. So you can see that you get just an incredible amount more diversity of trees and plants and stuff that take advantage of just that little bit of elevation change, that little change in the drainage of the soil. So we found that's extremely successful. I mean, we're probably creating a lot of great frog habitat and other habitat, but that isn't necessarily our intention. Our intention is to have some diversity in the soil. Mulching, this is, I mean, I think if you have endless money and if you have access, mulching is the best thing you could possibly do. Sadly, you know, we work in a lot of places that are kind of remote, they're hard to get to. Mulch is not, you know, is also suffered from inflation. It's gotten more and more expensive. So if we can get mulch into a site, we will. If we have the budget to, we will. And we use hog fuel, which is ground up primarily conifer trees, sometimes deciduous, but we're not buying from aspen. You know, we're not buying from somebody's just clearing the side of the road and there's a lot of invasives in it. We want to kind of know that it is primarily just ground up conifer stumps. And we have found that where we can use mulch, it has been great. I mean, it really lessens the maintenance. The plants do much better. And year 1 or year 2, you can reach your hand in and lift it up and you can see all the mycorrhizae fungi in there, which are definitely benefiting those plants. I saw pictures of Wendy with the sheet mulch in the cardboard. We would love to do that, but there's not enough cardboard in Whatcom County to do the number of sites that we have. It's not easy to transport, lay down. So on little small sites, we'll try cardboard, we'll sheet mulch and stuff. But it's just not amenable to bigger sites. I'm sorry, this picture isn't clear. So this just gives you a idea of hog fuel. So it's not bark mulch, you know, it's ground up trees. There's probably things in there that are 2 inches in diameter, 8 inches long. So it lasts quite a long time. And we like to mulch pretty heavily. And we like to mulch a 3-foot ring around the tree and about 8 inches deep. And if we can do this, we're probably not going to come back and maintain that plant. It's probably going to be just fine. This one would probably get a cage on it because it's a cedar and we won't want to worry about it getting chomped. The last thing I want to touch on is the monitoring aspect. And I put it here like, how do you fund? I guess that's not really a restoration goal, but it is very difficult to fund standalone monitoring. And some of our earlier projects, when Wendy and I first started, we had these really amazing 5-year grants that would include monitoring. Those kind of went to the wayside probably early 2000s. And then you just get, oh yeah, we'll fund you for a year or 2 years and you've got to restore this. And they would use verbs like, or words like that, you know, how many feet restored? And we're like, you can't possibly restore, well, you probably can't restore anything, period, to historical conditions, but you certainly, the process of restoration is long term. So very, very fortunate. We have a benefactor who's been funding our monitoring program for the last 3 years, and that's allowed us to go back and look at a lot of older sites. At a minimum, we want to monitor for 3 years after we plant. If there's a lot of invasives, we probably want to monitor 5 years. And in a perfect world, we kind of want to go back, 10 years and have a look and see, is it working? If you can't go out and monitor regularly, you're going to miss stuff. I mean, you might think, oh, everything looks great. And then you got some bad seedling stock and all of your cedars are dying on multiple sites. We've gone back to sites where we've never worried about fir trees and beaver. And we've had, 20-year-old fir trees, they've just gone in and take out all of them. So unless you can constantly kind of have eyes on the ground and see how you might want to adapt to something that you didn't anticipate, again, that could be the downfall of your project. The last thing I guess I want to touch on is this GIS. Smarter people than me, my staff, have developed a GIS database. So everything we plant, everything we monitor is all now in a GIS database. And if Eli or somebody here was smarter than me, they could show you this map and you can just click on it. It'll say when it was planted, when it was monitored, what was the success rate, what was planted. It's really amazing. And you could just say, okay, well, everything that was planted in the fall at this particular site, what was the survival? Everything that was planted in the spring on this particular site, what was the survival? So I think it's just amazing stuff. But I'm too old to learn about it. I'm just enjoying it. The last thing, I think Wendy mentioned this, volunteers, getting people involved. I don't think we'll have success unless you have community buy-in. So unless you get people involved, appreciating the efforts that what is undergoing on a particular site or just the process itself, then I didn't really put this in the first slide, like what I think it needs to succeed. But I firmly believe, if you don't have community buy-in, if you can't educate people, if you can't make them appreciate the resource, then again, you're probably gonna fail. So I'm sorry if that all sounds a little terse, but Wendy said, hey, well, why don't you put together a presentation of what you've learned? And that's kind of what I've learned. So I think Wendy had mentioned I'm going to close my presentation. And if anybody has any questions, or if it's something that takes longer than what we can address, I'd be happy to share my contact information. If you're up in the area and you want to go look at a site, that could probably be arranged too. But thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Daryl, do you want to begin by answering a number of questions that folks have written in the chat? So can you open up the chat, or should I read them to you? Either way.
Well, if you show me how to open up the chat, I can do it.
Read them.
Oh, I can see it.
Okay.
I can just click on it. Here we go.
Yeah.
Whoa, I can start with that shore pine.
Yes.
I don't have a love-hate relationship plant, because people will say, oh, shore pine will tolerate all these different conditions. And I'm gonna show my ignorance. 30 years ago, when I walked around Whatcom County, I never saw a shore pine. I'm very familiar with lodgepole pine and trees on the eastern side, but I never saw a shore pine. Then about 10 years after that, people say, oh yeah, shore pine. And you start to see more and more people planting them. I think I mentioned we really want to see some immediate result as far as shade, because we feel shade is probably, well, it's definitely beneficial for water quality. But as far as controlling reed canary grass, which kind of dominates most of the lowland streams, no shore pine is ever going to shade out reed canary grass. It's just not a big enough tree. Doesn't produce that much shade. And I must admit, where we did introduce it in the mid-90s, I'd come back 20 years. There was really nothing much there, so that's that's my narrow-minded opinion on shore pine. Every time my crew says, oh, we should plant some shore pine, I'm like, really? I mean, maybe some way back from the creek, but as far as immediately along the stream bank to produce grass or bit, I would say kind of a waste of time.
Ryan mentions western white pine, but I suppose it's the same issue for that pine too.
Yeah, and I apologize. I know we have planted western white pine, but I'm going to plead ignorance to that as far how successful it was. There probably was a reason why we stopped, but we did plant it at one time. But I apologize if I don't know the reason why we didn't continue.
Erin has a question about, they ask, did NC have you used or do you ever use goats for invasive exotic plant species physical control?
I've used them on my property. Very controlled, caged areas, did amazing jobs on ivy and stuff. I think, yes, you could do it, but you'd have to be very careful about how you do it, because I've had goats, I know neighbors have had goats, and yeah, you'd have to know more about goats than myself, but I don't see why you couldn't do it in a controlled environment, especially for site preparation, because when we bought our land and we brought goats in, they took everything to the ground and we were able to start again. It was wonderful. Yeah, I could see it as an application. I don't really know if we will get into it, but I could understand. I know they use it in forestry practices.
So Regina asks about whether you use
Imazapyr.
Yeah,
we're talking about it. We're thinking about using it. So I will have to admit, like when we first started, we're strictly no herbicide. And it took a number of years to talk the board into just using glyphosate. And then again, later on to use triclopyr, and imazapyr is probably on the list too. That's something we may try in the future. So far, we've had pretty good results with glyphosate and triclopyr, but as I guess I learn more, or some of my staff learns more about imazapyr, that might be something we try. My understanding, again, this is my ignorance, but my basic understanding is if you treat something with imazapyr, it's a longer lasting herbicide. So though I said you need to take the right amount of time, to prepare and get ready your sites, we're still trying to prepare them as fast as possible. And so with something like triclopyr or glyphosate, we can plant a couple of weeks after we apply, not necessarily the blackberry or something, but imazapyr, you probably shouldn't, in my understanding, you shouldn't probably plant for 6 months after you apply imazapyr.
Kim says seedlings planted on high banks of the South Fork near Acme were inundated by flooding this year. They were flattened and the blue tubes filled with sand.
Yes.
Maintenance will be pretty difficult and extremely time consuming. So the question is, what strategy do you think, excuse me, I have to scroll down, do you think might work to get the conifers back on those high eroding banks?
Yeah, and I know exactly the site you're talking about. So the property is 49 acres and it has probably about 600 feet of South Fork stream bank. Most of our planting probably over the last 20 years has been inland on a side channel and a number of other little tributaries that feed into the South Fork. And then when the land trusts were able to purchase the property, they said, well, we should do this planting right along the river. And I mean, it's definitely a high energy environment. So that was a big flood, but that bench floods constantly. So we have been through this before. Maybe sadly, the December 15th event was extremely high and did a lot of damage. I guess I kind of feel that that's probably the failure is kind of on us, trying to put conifers that close to the creek, or certain plants quite close to the creek where they would be seasonally inundated, and sediment would overcome those plants. Maybe that was being a little bit too optimistic. If you look at the buffers of creeks that are in that high energy system, you're going to see cottonwood, alder, others that are fast growing. And when you look around, you say, hey, everything's about 20 years old, 10 years old. That's because it's frequently inundated. So I think maybe that was a mistake on our behalf to try and introduce other longer lived species that close to the creek. That's not to say some of them won't survive, but obviously if we were inland, we might see 90% survival on our conifers, and in that situation we may only see 10% in the end. So I think it was just like, the land trust owns the property, let's plant it, let's get volunteers out. I'm not meaning to demean their efforts, I'm just saying maybe we should have thought through a little bit more about what the energy, or what the river might do to that planting, and maybe selected stuff that would deal better with those kind of flows. I hope that answers it. I mean, I hate to see volunteer or any planting efforts fail, but yeah, it's kind of sad.
A question from Candace. They ask, which plants have you found are most susceptible to deer browsing?
I guess the two that are coming to the list would be big leaf maple and western red cedar. So for some reason, and somebody who knows more about deer would know this than me, but deer will really hit western red cedar in the winter, so it must have some nutritional value to them. So if they're not in a cage, they will just nibble everything. I know this because I plant them all over my yard. I have a lot of deer. If I don't cage it, they will just take everything off of it. When I say big leaf maple, it's more like they'll reach, and keep taking the top off of it, and then it's very hard for the plant to succeed. So those are two plants that we always cage for deer. That said, I should say almost any plant, but alder, fir at about 3 or 4 years old just seem to have the right give. And so young male deer will rub their antlers on them and they'll just destroy a tree. And it just seems to be in that particular time frame. So we didn't usually cage fir, but then we started caging fir because deer would just destroy the plant, or alder would also do the same thing. So that's not a browsing thing, but those are probably where we find the most damage from deer, is the western red cedar, big leaf maple, and then fir or alder or something just at that right age.
I think that's all the questions that were on the chat. But at this point, everyone should be able to talk, all the participants. So participants, first of all, thank you so much for coming. And but now just unmute yourself and ask your question. So let's open
Daryl,
to everyone.
Daryl, it's Wendy. I had a question. Could you talk a little about willows? I know that Rich Hart had done a lot of research about willows and coppicing, and they don't really kill, the deer don't kill the willows, the beaver don't kill the willows. They coppice them and they'll grow again. But can you talk a little bit about some strategies of getting when you have a stream with no canopy closure and you want to get really fast growth? What is your strategy now, and what kind of willows? And then when do you interplant the conifers? Do you plant willows sometimes to get a real quick growth?
Yeah, I guess that was really interesting, because I think when we first started, we planted a lot of willow because we just wanted that immediate shade and that quick growth. However, that kind of led into some problems and problems that probably aren't problems. If you have a creek that is just bordered by reed canary grass. There's really no food source for beavers or deer or anything else. So pretty much dealing with voles if it's the edge of a pasture that's farmed. And then you plant a bunch of willow, grows very quickly, shade, but then you're suddenly inviting beaver and deer and other plants into your project site. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But let's say, again, you have a 30-foot buffer and you plant species that are good food source for beavers. Suddenly, I mean, I talked about deer browsing on cedar. Beaver will take every cedar out of a site instantly if they're present. So while I love beavers and are just inspired by the habitat they create, by planting willow, we're just kind of inviting beaver into our sites. The other factor too is if we're on a lot of creeks along farms who, are adverse to flooding, and we plant a lot of willow, it can grow laterally. Particularly, we used to plant a lot of schooler willow and hooker willow, and it would kind of grow laterally and kind of clog. So we convinced the farmer, hey, if you plant all this vegetation, it'll shade the creek, it'll improve your drainage, and then all of the willow grows into the creek, traps sediment, and the drainage is lost. We kind of dealt with a lot of blowback from that. So I'll be totally honest, we plant willow only in sites where we say, doesn't matter if it floods, doesn't matter if it dam, doesn't matter if anything, but if it is a section of creek that has other land use issues where people are not going to accept that kind of planting or whatever, we do not plant any willow. We'll stick to more like twinberry, 9-bark, redwoods or dogwood, stuff that beaver just tend to leave alone. And again, we're kind of playing God by saying, these are the species we're going to plant, where willow would probably be a native plant that would adapt really well to that situation. The current land use surrounding our site, it doesn't work. But I love willow.
Any other questions? Just go ahead and ask them. You should be able to.
Well, I guess I've got a question. I'm kind of in the middle.
Wendy or Daryl.
Can you hear me?
I can
Am
hear
I
you.
being heard? Okay. So I've been reading Suzanne Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, and I'm wondering if you guys are finding, how do I put it? The mycorrhizal relationships, and in terms of companion planting, in a natural sense, like planting, say, 9-bark with Douglas fir. Are you finding any success at combining certain plants with others?
I'll let Wendy start. How about you, Wendy?
Well, I'm just trying now with this new hedgerow, the pollinator hedgerow. So I've been getting some advice from the conservation district, and I've been looking at some of the hedgerows at Hovander Park, and I don't know, these aren't necessarily trees, but when I see, and probably England has more of a history of this, but the hedgerows that have been planted with maybe 5 to 10 diverse species, and you maintain them, and they seem to be growing together well. I don't know if there's a mycorrhizal relationship, because I really don't know much about mycorrhizae and shrubs. But I've just been trying to experiment a little bit more with, things like different kinds of roses, different kinds of, 9-bark, red osier dogwood, snowberry, and just intertwining them together. And so it's not like, like a horticultural wonder. It's more like of a messy little hedgerow, but it's contained in a certain kind of a linear way. And so that's my experiment right now. So I don't know if I really haven't read that book. So, you know, I know about mycorrhizal fungi, and I know more about the old growth, you know, woods here. And we know that you can buy mycorrhizal fungi tea bags and put them in your planting hole. And there's been some experiments on Shell Creek over there by the casino, and they did so well there. But I don't know if anybody knows here if there's been much research here in Whatcom County with mycorrhizal fungi. Does anybody know?
I don't know. I just know that, you know, when we're kind of shift from kind of a bacterial based, you know, soil ecology of grasslands or pasture and trying to move it more to fungi, it has certainly helped us by adding this hog fuel, you know, which is ground up conifer stumps. I'm not familiar with the book, but I have read little articles in companion planting. I wouldn't say that we're doing it intentionally, but you know, on a certain site, if we think about more well-drained soil, the limebark's going to do great. Fir is probably going to do good. So maybe by happenstance, we are planting those close to one another. But I hadn't really ever thought about it as a relationship between those two plants. Again, I'm just a pragmatist saying the limebark's going to do good here. It's going to arch over the creek. It is going to, you know, on higher flow events, it's going to bend. It's going to take up energy, disperse energy, and the tree up above it is going to fare well because of that. But I hadn't really thought about a relationship, you know, through the soil or through fungi between those two plants. So maybe I need to do some more reading.
Okay, nobody's chiming in, so I have another question. In my own yard, you talked about de-leveling, which
Yeah.
I interpret as saying you planted things in mounds. I did that in my yard because I'm in a wetland, more or less, and I wanted to plant things that, you know, I thought things might get too much water. So I just made big mounds of earth, basically, you know, stuff you get at a nursery. My problem is that the mounds have eroded away and the roots are being exposed. So I'm wondering how you did it that you avoid that.
Well, the mounds are pretty big. Like we have to follow, you know, NRCS guidelines and obviously Army Corps, but we can't. We're aiming for a forested wetland, and so, you know, we have to make this argument that we need these higher, more well-drained soils, but we can't diminish the hydric nature of the soil around it. They're pretty big and pretty substantial. And for good or bad, the reed canary grass still dominates around them and moves up the sides of the mound. So maybe that is protecting us from erosion around the edge of the mound. But I mean, if you look at that picture, I don't know how big your mounds are, but I would say our mounds are probably got 20, 30 cubic yards of soil. You know, it's sizable. So yes, water could erode the edge of it, but again, the grass surrounding it is going to kind of move back into the mound. What we're trying to do is keep that grass up the top of the mound and not competing. And then of course, create, you know, more well-drained soil. You know, what that slide that looked at the soils that are kind of dominant in the areas we worked, you know, it's always like rooting depth. And, you know, when you ever see like a big cedar fall over, it's like, boy, that tree wasn't 2 feet in the ground. It's spread out a lot, but it's just sitting right on the top of the water table. So we're just trying to get above the water table a little bit, give it an opportunity. So I don't know if that answers your question, but again, I think it's probably because we have a lot more soil and then we have this grass that quickly, we seed everything, you know, with a shorter fescue, but inevitably the reed canary grass will dominate the edges of those mounds.
Interesting. Yeah, I was using maybe, 4 or 5 wheelbarrows full of soil.
Yeah,
Obviously too small, and I didn't worry about the anchoring the soil with grasses or anything. So that's good point. Probably my last question is yellow cedar or incense cedar, giant sequoia. Seriously, aren't those invasives? I'm kidding. I'm kidding,
well,
sort of.
we're definitely, I'm not a religious person, but we're definitely playing God. I mean, we're just saying it's getting too dry, for Western red cedar. I mean, you read everything. I mean, I'm going to forested settings where all the Western red cedar are drying and the water, it's spongy under my feet. So obviously things are changing, and we started noticing.
You're I don't know what the term is. There's a term for planting things in anticipation of global warming. So
Exactly. We just feel like those plants aren't going to move from California or the border of Oregon fast enough up here. And it kind of comes back again, being pragmatic. We're like, we've got this narrow buffer. If we lose all the Western red cedar in that buffer, like, what do we have? So for starting a number of years back, we don't plant strictly Western red cedar just because we couldn't afford to lose it all. So if it makes it, great, but we're not going to plant 5 Western red cedar in a row, because if we lost all that, then that would be kind of the end of that buffer, or a substantial setback on that buffer as far as fish are concerned. And post pre the last ice age, there were a lot of those species up here. So we're definitely jumping the gun and saying, well, we're just going to move them up here. And I have planted sequoia in the past and a lot of yellow cedar, and they've done really, really well. So I haven't planted, I have one incense cedar in my yard, and it's done really well too. But I guess again, we're looking for an alternative to Western red cedar should its demise continue at the current rate of what people are seeing. Sadly, because I think Western red cedar is the best tree around, but just being a realist.
Understood.
And Daryl, as wonderful as the tree is the incense cedar effective in suppressing the reed canary grass?
Yeah. So again, fir trees, they kind of naturally are going to, limb themselves, and you will not have a lot of cover on a creek. But incense cedar, Western red cedars, giant sequoia, they're long-lived, produce a tremendous amount of shade. So for us, though, again, we're trying to benefit fish. So we're kind of jumping succession. We're moving trees north, but we want 100 years down the road to be some substantially large conifer trees that are shading those creeks.
Well,
so how long? Yeah, I'm just thinking, just a very quick follow-up about the time sequence here. How long before, say, do they have to, at 10 feet tall, is incense cedar already starting to
yes,
beat down the reed canary?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. We were talking about this today. I mean, you'll start to see some changes, maybe even around 5 years, just to be some grass, but by 10 years, you've got some pretty good canopy closure. Yeah.
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, I mean, I think incense cedar is realistically fits in this environment. It grows in Western Oregon, at least south of Eugene. It's common. Giant sequoia, we're never going to be the Sierra Nevadas. It's such a totally different habitat.
I know, and I think I mentioned it in our study. Giant sequoia is kind of picky. It's kind of like Western red cedar. It hasn't done so well And yet I've got two in my yard, and they're doing incredibly well. So in the right situation, they do very well.
Oh yeah,
And-
there's some near Whatcom Creek behind the police department and at Western on campus. There's
Yeah,
giant
that's an
sequoias that
amazing tree.
they just
Yeah.
seem, they don't, I just think they don't belong here, but.
I would
cedar-
agree, and you can correct me on this, but I have read some papers that before the last ice age, they still find stumps and stuff of sequoia all through upper North America that existed.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a stretch.
Yeah, okay.
I think we just thought we also went with Pacific redwood and
Coast
we
redwood?
have, Dara, we have planted some coastal redwood, but we have talked to a number of people that have tried that before. Same with Port Orford cedar, and they have not done so well in the longer term. So we didn't include them in our study, which I guess set up with an experimental design, but we still have planted some in different places, and they're a beautiful tree and they seem to be doing well. But we decided we were just going to focus on 3 trees that we thought would be successful. I mean, we've been planting yellow cedar for a long time, and obviously it's native at higher elevations, and it seems to do well. You know, down here, it's not as fast growing as Western red cedar. It has a little bit less predation from deer. Maybe younger deer will kind of take a stab at it, but older deer kind of leave it alone. Yeah, so we'll just have to kind of see, I guess, where it goes. And I see maybe there's an ethical problem there. You know, jumping the gun and moving those plants north, but the amount of yellow cedar. I walked on a site the other day, and it was just a forested site. Probably no tree in that stand under 50, 60 years old. And 90% of the cedar were dead. They're completely dead. Big
Red
trees.
cedar.
Western red cedar.
Well,
Well,
it's
I was going to
interesting.
ask about the yellow cedar because, I mean, it likes cooler, wetter environments than the Western red cedar and definitely than the incense. So I don't understand how it's doing better where you're losing red cedar and where the incense.
I don't know either. I don't really. And I guess this isn't science. This is just what we've noticed. So that's why we set up these test plots and got funding for this 10-year study. And maybe 10 years isn't long enough. Maybe it's got to go out further. But I know in crepe plantings, they started to introduce Western red cedar, or sorry, yellow cedar, probably about almost 10 years ago. And I've been out on crepe sites, and those cedar trees are doing really well. I don't really know why.
I've got about a dozen in my front yard, and every one of them has survived so far, and it's been about 7 years. So there's something going on there.
Yeah, I know it's just a tougher plant. I mean, yellow cedar, I think even in the beginning before this, it just seems like temperamental. Like it like here, or I was on a site today and people were saying, oh yeah, Western red cedar, I'm like, you're in the outflow path, you know, the south of the Fraser River, and you get a warm spell like today, and what's predicted over the next 4 or 5 days, I think red cedar start to come out of dormancy, start to grow, and then February, mid-February, early March, you get another cold wind out of the northeast, and those trees will be dead, or they'll be seriously compromised. And I don't know, are they dumb trees? Like, why do they start growing before they know that it's the end of it? But we'll have right beside them, we'll have yellow cedar, and they'll survive that. I got to be able to learn how to talk to trees, I guess. Find out why they're doing this.
But those cedars have been dealing with the Fraser outflows for millennia.
Yeah, that's true. And I think in a larger forest setting, that might be the case, but where you've had all this land use practices, primarily agriculture, that has cleared, you know, vast swaths of land, the impact of that wind is much greater when you go into a creek that has that exposure and you plant the Western red cedar. and it doesn't have any buffer around it. It has no forest around it. And like I said, where we've seen most of the mortality has been northeast wind exposure or hot summer exposure on a west or southwest facing stream bank. And you're right, in a bigger forested setting, it wouldn't have had that exposure.
So maybe use the incense cedar as a nursery and by and by replace them with the western cedar once the reed canary is gone and you've got more shelter for the.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I did mention that too. Prior to this, we were definitely where we were seeing those effects. I was more the southwest afternoon summer sun. We're planting a lot of alder. Like we would not plant a western red cedar unless it was surrounded by alder. So we want that immediate, we want that shade, we want the nitrogen input, and those have done well. But on their own, just out, in that sun, or even in our own nursery, this stuff under the cedar under the shade cloth does way better than the cedar out in the open sun. Oh, sorry, I'm taking western red cedar is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was out at NC in our plant sale last year. I noticed a lot of your cedars in the pots were kind of yellowish.
Yeah.
And I had some here at home in pots. And a friend of mine, she said, I wonder if they're getting sunburnt. And so I moved them into a shady area and they all turned green.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah,
I don't think it necessarily kills them, but it definitely you'll get that reddish, from wind or cold wind or whatever, and they'll eventually snap back out of that. But I think what Anna was talking about, like if there'll be a later succession conifer that's going to come up under the canopy and then eventually, get past the fir and all this stuff, but they're in the shade. They're not starting out in broad sun, so I think our earlier planting efforts, like we're going to create a forest, we're just going to plant everything out there, and you're just like, well, the vine maple doesn't want to be out in the bright sun. I mean, not even salmonberry wants to be out in the bright sun immediately. So yeah, we're definitely trying to choose plants that we think will survive out in a much different environment than they would have evolved or in that process of succession. So
Wow.
we're kind of cherry picking what we think will do the best in a given situation, which is probably not a natural situation, or we know it's not a natural situation.
Well, we seem to be losing our audience.
yeah. So getting towards 9 o'clock. So
Yep.
Yes. I just want to thank you, Daryl and Wendy. Many people in the chat have appreciated